So Mitchell has a plan to save us from all these burdensome and unnecessary admissions and probably help the mental health of some of these athletes who, if they're, trying to do work, it's got to be pretty hard. So Mitchell Wilson, who was a total gentleman in this group and worked hard and just totally first rate in all ways and represented himself and anybody really well. I was a goalie of the soccer team while he completed this program, which is very impressive. And apparently he was pretty good at being a goalie too. So realignment of NCAA Division I football to reduce travel emissions and revitalize regional athletic activity. Mitchell Wilson.
Thank you for the introduction, Corey. Pretty much summed up my whole project right there. But I'll go over it again. So my name is Mitchell. I'm exploring the realignment of NCAA Division I football in order to reduce travel emissions and revitalize regional athletic rivalries. Just a little introduction to my project. Basically, my research project aimed at reducing college football's carbon footprint by presenting a completely different outlook on scheduling, advocating to be put in place somewhere within the next decade to 15 years. For those of you who are not aware, 2024 is bringing conference realignment, which completely changes the outlook of college football. Like Corey said, teams like Cal and Stanford, who were once in the Pac-12, will be traveling across country to the ACC, which is the Atlantic Coastal Conference. Same thing with UCLA and USC, traveling to the Big Ten now. So basically, I implemented a theoretical model based on geography of teams and then compared that against the 2024 travel schedule to see if it would actually cut down on aviation emissions. In my model, I basically advocated for shorter travel miles, a decrease on the reliance of airplanes, a smarter postseason alignment, meaning less bowl games, which we'll get to, and then a side emphasis on promoting student-athlete mental health, as well as travel and stadium sustainability. So this is the Power 5 conferences a couple years ago. As you can see, they're pretty regionally based. You got the Pac-12 on the West Coast, ACC on the East Coast, Big Ten in the North Midwest, SEC in the South, and then the Big 12 kind of stretches throughout the country. This is what they're going to look like next year. As you can see, the logic is kind of thrown out the window. You have the ACC is stretching from Miami up to Boston, all the way to Northern California. The Big Ten stretches from Southern California up to Seattle, all the way over to New Jersey. The SEC stays kind of similar. The Big 12 expanded a little bit, but the Pac-12 is now completely gone, so we're down to a Power 4 conferences. So the objectives of my study were basically to quantify the increase of air mileage in 2024 to what it could be if it was logically based on geography, like it was back in the 1980s. Secondly, I wanted to assess the environmental impact of aviation emissions, as well as examining the effects on student athletes and proposing sustainability suggestions for the league in their travel and stadium operations. And then lastly, providing some policy recommendations promoting future research on the topic. There's not an industry quite like sports that travels on such a regular basis, so it's a very unique place. So why is this an issue? Basically, aviation pollution is emissions produced by aircraft during flight, including CO2, nitrous oxides, particulate matter, and water vapor. The CO2 comes from the jet fuel combustion, which is the primary greenhouse gas. Aviation contributes to 2 to 3% of all global CO2 emissions, and higher altitude emissions have a disproportionate effect on the atmosphere, basically warming at twice the rate as what happens on the ground. Nitrous oxides and particulate matter also increase the impact of respiratory health issues, and water vapor and contrails contribute to the warming effect through things like cloud formation and nutrient deposition, harming soil and water ecosystems. So this is how I went about setting up my theoretical model. Basically, my main goal is to minimize the travel distances, as well as maintain the competitive balance, which is important for college football, and even more importantly, preserving traditional rivalries. Rivalries that have been in place through World War I, World War II, and the pandemic are now gone, which might hurt economic revenue and TV viewership. And then lastly, shortening the postseason, which I'll get to soon. How I went about my process was basically ranking teams based off their turn of the century performance, as well as their schedule, their strength of schedule, which is the RPI. And then after that, I had to cluster them geographically and make schedules for the 72 teams I studied. My structure came out with a division of the top 72 teams in 4 different conferences: the West, the Central, the South, and the East. Each conference had 18 teams, and then further divided up based on geography into 2 divisions of 9. And then there's also a lower division made up of 64 teams in 4 different conferences of 16, divided up into 2 divisions of 8. For the purpose of my data collection, I only looked at the top 72 teams. I didn't have a chance to get to the bottom 64, but this is what it would look like in the theoretical model. You can look for your alumni up here, your favorite college football team, see what they would look like in this geographical model. And just a side note here, this is like a 10-year transition period at least suggested. There's a lot of TV deals, conference agreements, and schedules in place right now. So this isn't realistically possible next year or even 5 years from now. But long term, it could be way more sustainable. Now for the postseason is probably the most important part of college football. In 2024, we'll see 43 different bowl games. Most of these are meaningless. Players and coaches oftentimes don't even play or coach in these games. They get fired or they move on to their next job. Players enter the transfer portal if they don't like where they're playing. This leads to low attendance ratings and low TV ratings, as well as a lot of excessive travel. For example, last year we had Coastal Carolina playing San Jose State in Hawaii, which had I think that was the 8100 bowl game. But 7 bowl games in 2023 had less than 12,200 people, 3 of those less than 8,100. In the geographical model, there's only 19 bowl games. All of these are meaningful. The college football playoff, which is probably the most important part of the season, remains the same in both models. I try to keep that as that was pretty vital. And then I added 8 promotion, 8 relegation games, which we'll get to in a second. But side note here also, these are all campus hosted. Bowl games are all at neutral sites in the 2024 model. In my model, they're all campus hosted, still labeled as bowl games for sponsorship deals and economic revenue. For example, we could have Penn State playing Michigan in a national semifinal in, say, Glendale, Arizona, or Atlanta, Georgia, where a lot of students can't even go to, or a lot of fans have to travel to. In my model, they'd be playing in Ann Arbor or in Happy Valley, where there'd be a lot more students, a little better atmosphere. On the right here is an example of what the East-North Conference and Division would look like here. Theoretically, we have Penn State winning the North, advancing to the college football playoff, Liberty getting last place, meaning the relegated Division II, James Madison promoted from Division II to Division I, and then our bowl game for this division would be Rutgers hosting UConn. Instead of Rutgers having to play a team like San Jose State or something random that nobody's going to watch, this is going to be a regional matchup that's going to create a lot of TV revenue. Probably not going to bat your eye at this game if it happens in the regular season. Both these teams are fighting for their life and more economic revenue in the next few years. Everyone's going to be watching it. This is how I calculated my mileage measurements here. Basically, each of the 72 teams I studied was assigned a home airport they fly out of. For example, UW or Washington would be flying out of SeaTac, or USC, UCLA would be flying out of LAX. Sometimes it's not always that simple, though. I use aviation mapping software between 2 points, adding stops if it was not typical for direct flights to fly from certain airports. For example, in the top right here, we have Oklahoma State visiting Vanderbilt and Nashville. Stillwater Regional does not fly direct to a lot of places, so they have to stop in Dallas on their way. Same thing in the bottom right here, we have Kansas State visiting University of Iowa, first having to stop in Chicago. It's worth noting here that these are approximate estimates on mileage, as there's an abundance of factors, as we all know when flying. Things like weather, time of year could change your flight pattern or your layover or your timing. And also big budget teams like USC or Ohio State or even University of Florida might be able to charter private flights so they don't have to deal with these layovers. So this is the numbers I came up from my data collection. Basically 59 out of the 72 teams saw reduced air mileage in my model. 38 of those 59 saw a significant reduction of air travel, which is over 2,550 air miles, which is half the geographical average. I'll get that in the next slide. And then on the other side of the coin, we had 13 out of 72 actually increase in air travel, with only 3 out of the 72 or 3 out of those 13 significantly increasing air travel. In 2024, the top 72 teams will travel over 600,000 miles, or 8,300 per team. In the geographical model, it's almost half that, down to 367,000 or 5,100 per team, equating to a 233,000 mile difference, or 3,200 per team, represented by this line connecting the two graphs right here. It's quite a bit of a difference. So how does this equate to CO2? Basically in 2024, there'll be 1.92 metric tons of CO2 released per team out of the top 72. That's down to 1.17 in the geographical model, which is a total reduction for 54 metric tons of CO2, equating to about 16 round trip flights from New York City to London. This isn't looking at other pollutants, this is just looking at CO2. 16 round trip flights may not seem like a lot to some people for a whole league, but when you count in the rest of the 64 teams in the FBS division, as well as all the other sports in NCAA Division I, you have softball teams, baseball teams, soccer teams, basketball teams, all making these same trips. It's going to add up pretty quick. These are the 10 teams that benefited the most from the reduction in air mileage here. No surprise, all these schools are on the West Coast. UCLA, Cal, Stanford, USC all benefit from not having to travel across country multiple times a year. Penn State also doesn't have to come to the West Coast anymore. SMU benefits from a lot of regional matchups in the Dallas area. There's a lot of FBS schools located in that region. And then Missouri is kind of a unique case. They're kind of located in a spot where it's easier to bus to neighboring states instead of fly. So they benefit from busing a lot in my theoretical model. These are the only 3 teams that saw an increase in air mileage in the theoretical model. All these schools are in the South, if you can tell. The South isn't as good with airport infrastructure as the rest of the country. Florida and Arkansas is worth noting that they only play 4 or 5 away games in 2024. A lot of schools do this in order to generate more revenue by hosting more games. USF is the only team out of the 72 that played 6 away games and saw a significant increase in air mileage. This also affects student-athlete mental health, which is something that is not often touched on with conference realignment. Student-athletes miss a lot of classes during road trips, which can be increase even more if longer travel plans force programs to depart earlier or even stay later. Studies out of Boise State and Hawaii, which are 2 schools that travel a lot for sports, report heightened levels of stress, fatigue, classes missed, and worse academic performance. Basically, limiting the distance students have to fly or giving them options to bus gives students more time, energy, and focus to be able to perform in class. These are some ideas I came up with my committee to implement in travel. Things like purchasing carbon offsets or collaborating with airlines that use the latest fuel technology. Things like sustainable aviation fuel, which is an alternative fuel made from non-petroleum feedstocks, reduces emissions from air transportation. Ideas such as busing for under 300 miles, which I incorporate into my model, as well as adopting EVs into their athletic departments would significantly cut down on their carbon footprint on the ground. And then something I'm not aware of that any program does at the moment is experimenting with train travel. For schools that are close to infrastructure that supports this, for mid-length distances, it could be very beneficial. Looking at stadiums here, solar panels, LED and rainwater could all contribute to a decrease in carbon footprint. The stadium on the top right here is a Turkish football club known as Galatasaray, who's outfitted their roof with solar panels throughout it. We see this a lot in Eastern Europe, and it's something we haven't really incorporated too much into our stadium infrastructure here in the States, as well as phasing out night games. If we only played games in the day, that would cut a lot of things out. That would have a lot of issues with TV deals, though, which could be an issue. And then something that is probably not going to be a very popular suggestion here, but replacing stadium food with locally farmed foods. Instead of eating your popular hot dog with hot Cheetos on it, we could be eating some fresh fruit instead, which could help local farmers as well. And then also something that teams don't really do enough of is engaging the fans, promoting things like zero waste games where you bike or carpool to the stadium instead of just driving yourself into a big parking lot, as well as hosting like a farmer's market at the stadium. It could be really cool ideas to get people on board with sustainability. Some future policy changes that I think we'll be seeing in the next 10 years in the NCAA are things like requiring affiliated institutions to calculate and offset their travel emissions, as well as providing incentives for using buses or trains for shorter trips, and sustainability certifications. This building we're in right now is LEED certified, but programs can also be sustainably certified. Basically, if they meet certain benchmarks like reducing their travel emissions, recycling programs, or renewable energy, they could be certified, looking good for their fans and to the public. And then lastly, just some future recommendations. I only had the chance to get to the 72 teams, like I said in the study, but if I could, I'd expand this to all 144 teams. And then even from there, maybe even look at some other sports such as baseball, which travels back and forth even more than football, as well as a practical implementation model. Basically, exploring steps that need to be taken to realistically implement a model like this. It's definitely not going to be easy. It's going to face a lot of backlash. For that reason, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But by 15 years or so, I think we'll be seeing a pushback, forcing more into the pro-climate activists. Quick shout out to the committee members. Corey, Michelle, Monica, and Sojana were a huge help and gave me some really good ideas. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
So is there a plan for getting this to the powers that be?
I did look into that. I was trying to do a presentation to certain conferences and stuff, but I couldn't find anybody that would actually listen to me or even respond to any of my inquiries. But yeah, I think it's going to be tough to get to that point. But I think at a certain point, the public's going to kind of demand a change. So, Tom?
Thank you, Mitch, for the presentation. I was wondering, like, could you replicate that for the professional league, or do they like have another way of building all the championship?
That's a good question. That's kind of been in place for a while with the professional league. This is kind of like changing, like this just as years, making a huge difference. So I think it would be harder in that sense. And those teams kind of like make more, I don't know if they make more money technically, but I think it'd just be harder to like at a professional level. All right, thank you guys.